And I think we are live. Hello, sirs. Okay, so before we get started, let me just do some audio triage and see how we're going.
Sounds good.
Okay, so um, I will play the role of host. I'm Steve Endo, and with me are two prominent guests, Jeremy and Henrik. Would you guys like to introduce yourself?
Hello, Jeremy Visca, longtime NAV developer and currently running Spare Brained Ideas. And I had the idea for this crazy chat, and we'll explain that after Henrik's introduction.
Good morning for those of us here in the US. Good evening for those of you in Europe, and good whatever time it is, wherever you are. My name is Henrik Helgesen. I am the double eight. I am a dinosaur in the NAV world. Thank you to David Singleton for coming up with that terminology. Been doing NAV development since 1995 and growing up with that, so to speak. And I guess back in the days I was known as the GUI police. Which is I think is why Jeremy wrote me to be part of this.
Excellent. I see Stefan has joined the chat, and he says we're sounding good. So I think we're okay on video. The audio is the only element I wasn't quite sure of. So if we're getting some bizarre echo, let me know, and I'll try to troubleshoot it live. So, gentlemen, I will just sit back and let you guys chat. How does that sound?
Sure thing.
Okay.
So the trigger behind this particular little idea was I had not too long ago been asked to look at another shop's code to evaluate its work. And right about the same time, Henrik and I were chatting about some code that I had made available publicly, and he had some great feedback to me about some of the things that were not following standards. And I went and looked, and turned out there were some things that I had lost along the way. And it seemed like a really interesting opportunity to ask you to play host for this, because I know, Steve, you've talked in the recent past about how the NAV/BC community, sometimes we can be very prescriptive of you have to do things the right way. And that led to an interesting delve where I realized there were things that I was not doing the right way. So I thought it would be fun for the three of us to kind of look at some of the history of where Cal was and some of the guidelines and how that has evolved over time, and talk about, how are devs today, like yourself, who is just, relatively recently joined the space, how are you supposed to know these things, and how are you affected by them still, even if you don't know them? So that was the general idea.
And for context, for those watching, I've spoken to Jeremy and Henrik about this in the past. My background from the Dynamics GP world is actually mostly doing .NET development and formerly VB, but for many years C#.NET development. And although there are different techniques and styles and kind of general guidelines for doing things, there are 5 different ways of doing any given thing. And if I encounter someone else's code where they did it this way or that way, or I would have done it differently, as long as it's not like horrible and just bad practice, like from Dev 101, I'm like, okay, great. They use this style, they use this technique, they use this feature. Fine. Like I just adapt to the code, and as long as it functions, I'm okay with it in general. So my conversation with Jeremy and Henrik has been, wow, BC and AL seem to be a little different based on the conversations I'm picking up. So
I think the traditional, one of the reasons for that, in particular, if we take a step backwards in the NAV world, was the code was written and was saved in the database, and by definition, you should never think that I am the last one to see this code, because it is not being compiled into a DLL or something else. And if you don't follow the standards, that means it's really hard for somebody else to skim your code. I know myself, I have worked with people who, no matter what there was a variable in there called RAUX. Sometimes it was a decimal, sometimes it was an integer, sometimes it was a record. You literally had to go and look at the variable definition, right? So when you, as a developer, is trying to skim some code and you come over something that doesn't follow those general accepted practices, it slows you down.
Understood.
And another, I think, important part is, I mean, we always like to talk about nav as Lego bricks, right? You can build all this great functionality and put on, and those are all Lego bricks. In my world, that is absolutely correct. However, if I have a yellow wall of Lego bricks, I don't want to see a red one and a blue one and a pink one all over the place, right? So again, by following the standards, you now have a complete flow in your ERP. I mean, I always my biggest fear almost is if I do something that it stands out. Oh, that's something so and so did, right? And you should not be able to tell as a user what is an extension, so to speak, or what is standard functionality. It should be, this is my product.
Via the UI, for instance.
Yep.
Right.
And
that makes sense.
And that goes with some of the nomenclature that is used. It is not called ID; it's called number, NO, for master data. Right? It's called code if it's a subsidiary table, so to speak, and stuff like that.
Yeah. So to zoom out just a little bit too, one of the things that I think helps understand people coming into the space, it does feel very restrictive. It does feel like things have to be done a certain way or you get some grief from people. And I think it would be of benefit to look at a couple of old things real quick that I had uncovered while digging around a little bit. For example, the entire industry was extremely prescriptive. This was, for example, the slides from back in the early 2000s from the US branch of Navision. You had to have certified people in all of these different processes to be a partner. That included how you do your sales, that included how you managed your product, that included all of the consultants, and that included the solution developers. So right off the bat, the business ecosystem was very prescriptive. So that kind of fed into that, and that stuck around for a long time. Microsoft evolved it through the learning paths. It was still towards certifications, but it wasn't quite the same level of requirement as it was in the old days, where you could very easily find yourself in a situation where you had to quickly get someone certified, or you wouldn't be a partner the next year. So,
interesting.
Yeah. And they had a really, really big focus right from out of the gate in some of the old documentation, which I know looks as dated as it is, that you had to be able to do the tasks efficiently, provide a good solution, and it had to be long-term supportable. And that was something that they were really keen on right from the get-go, that you had to make it maintainable.
I love the clip art personally.
Yeah, right.
Right. Some of the old late '90s documents definitely didn't quite have the polish that we're accustomed to these days. But,
nice.
They were genuine. And yeah, those were some of, like Henrik was saying, some of the rules were things like you had to make as few changes as possible, and you had to give the product a consistent look and feel. Those were core concepts to the business model that we were required to do as developers. And that's an interesting kind of historical look. So most of us went through a process where doing the solution that worked but wasn't standard was strongly frowned upon right from the authority that could revoke your ability.
Well, I mean, not even that. So, as you know, I was born and raised in Denmark, and in my youth, I ended up going to CeBIT in Germany, and actually went to the Navision's booth there and saw Navision, and it's one of the things that I think some people find interesting is that if you look at a customer card and a vendor card in Navision, or BC now for that matter, you really don't see much difference, right? Whereas back in those days, and I don't know how it is today, but back in those days, I actually went and saw Great Plains, and they had a screen up with a customer card and a screen up with a vendor card, and I looked at it kind of, wait, is this the same piece of software? Because they didn't even have the same color scheme. So, and I think part of the reasons for that is, Navision is a Danish product originally, right? And in many companies in Denmark just don't get to a size where you have a dedicated person that all he or she does is pay vendors, and another customer and another person, all they do is collect money from customers, meaning you have the same people having to deal with customers. You have this customers and vendors, and probably maybe even item card maintenance. So I think that's why the thing for making sure things look the same is there, and to tell a little story about some of my work that I did in Denmark. I had done a report or a request page on a report, and man, it was cool. If you check this thing up, these 2 new fields showed up that you now have to make a selection from. And I, went and showed this. I stood tall and walked over to my mentor and said, "Look at this," and he looked at me. "Oh, that's kind of cool. Why do they do that in the standard product?" "Nowhere." "Okay, well, how do you do it?" "Well, if we don't do it in the standard, we don't do it either." I was yanked down from that pedestal I crawled up on, and and those are the kind of things that really stood by me through my career.
Well, Jeremy, to your point about the guidelines that are stressed in that documentation, was some of that due to the fact that the core application was being modified, and it's less of an extensibility model that, like with BC?
That's definitely a key factor to it, in that it was easier to maintain code if it was consistent throughout, and that included in the upgrade process. If you were following the guidelines, it made it simpler for maintainability. And a challenge I think that Navision had as a company early on was adoption. And if you had a customer with a Navision system, they felt the ownership of that relationship with that customer. And so if that customer was working with a partner who didn't follow any of the standards, and they got very frustrated with things not working, they took it very personally that their product was not delivering on things. And it was very difficult for another partner to then recover the process back to functional state. So there was a lot more hands-on
to protect their brand as well.
Absolutely. And it was important because of the scale of the business. They were a much smaller organization than Microsoft, because everyone is. And they had a real incentive to make sure that when people heard the name, they knew what they were going to see throughout the product.
Got it.
And to that end, that kind of brings naturally to kind of one of the next topics, which is to talk about what was the guide and where we're going. So just a brief little tour through some things. Once upon a time, there was the programming guide. It was your reference book. I managed to happen to find in my archives the 1996 version instead of the 2000 version I had been reading through prior to this discussion. So that ended up being a fun find. But this had all of the concepts around how you were supposed to do your statements, how you were designing your product, all the things that you were going to do as a developer were in sort of this guidebook. There were a couple of things things that would be bounced out, like they note abbreviations, but that was per language, so it varied. But in these days, now we have a few different sources that we need to go to. We have the rules and guidelines sections on the doc site. We have the programming chapters on the doc site. A bunch of the standards of practice are now built into the AL formatter, and many of them have migrated into the code cops as well. And there is also a community design pattern for some things. So what was interesting to me is that when I went to go digging into this a little bit of how have these evolved over time, right in the best practices for AL, there is this little note up at the top that says, if a best practice isn't mentioned here, then the pre-cal rules apply. And when I dug into that, it's the evolved version of this Cal guidebook. It's not currently available. If you were to go to that page, this won't get you anywhere, but you can chase it up if you look. However, it's not quite the same as what it used to be. And it's interesting to see how, if you compare the different decades across things, you can see how things evolved, and you see which ones were more important to Microsoft and how those ones that were more important became code cops, and the ones that weren't classified in that same category of ease of identifiability didn't migrate into that. But a bunch of those did come into the sections of the doc site. Like, for example, here in the control statement, they put these little notes in that say, here are the conventions around how you should do this. And I thought that was an interesting way. So there isn't this one big book you can bust out and say, here on page 69, you forgot this one thing. But they did move a lot of things into the AL formatter, and a lot of things are now in Code Cop, for good or for bad. I think for good. I think there's a lot of good to what these do. And someone reminded me today, I think it was AJ, that there is a wiki page about design patterns. And I admit I poked around in there for an hour or so and found it a little challenging to navigate that space. And I'm not sure if that is active anymore. It seems like it was an initiative in 2015 for a few years. I haven't seen a lot of activity in that space.
Yeah, so, I mean, you can see that the last update was in July of 19. So,
yeah, exactly. So it was an interesting sort of exploration. I said, okay, well, what I think I would like to do with you guys today is kind of let's look at some of the things that are in the old guidebook and go, how have these evolved, and what's different and what's changed. And some of them are sort of fun, and you'll laugh, Steve, at just how, like we said, prescriptive some of these things are. I mean, just down to the level of if you're going to indent your characters, indent by this many. And it's very super tight and tightly controlled on all these different things. So I thought that was an interesting way to see some of the different examples on that. I do see in the comments that Waldo is saying that the design patterns wiki has the pre-cal rules, and that's true that it did. Unfortunately, that's what is linked from the docs page, and it's a broken link. So But there are a bunch of things in here that I learned when we moved to BC. There are some rules in here I forgot about. So, for example, simple things like little one-liners where it says, repeat should be on a line by itself. The formatter does that for you. You can't violate that rule without shutting off the formatter, which is kind of interesting. And I'm curious, Steve, with your experience with .NET, are the linters and things like that you use in the .NET space anywhere near as focused on making the code shaped a certain way?
I don't know. I don't really pay attention to it, honestly. It's just like I just look at the code and it's like reading the Matrix, and I see what they're doing. And my perspective is I see code where I know the person who wrote the code is significantly more competent than me technically at writing the code. But when I stand back and I look at what this person is doing, the overall solution is a disaster. So my concern is less what variable names did they use, and did they use plus, plus, plus equals? Did they consolidate 3 lines into a fancy one-liner in C#? And did they know what they were doing? And like, I can deal with different variable names, formatting, indents, whatever. But when they're using an approach that's a nightmare to maintain, the syntax is irrelevant. And so I've gotten over the nitpickiness of syntax, like whatever, I can adjust. As long as I can read it and figure it out, I can deal with it. And it's more the overall solution that is my concern.
Fair enough.
And no, I agree with you, Steve. I mean, that's why my thing has always been, quite honestly, yeah, it's you may be the best developer in the world, but if you don't understand business concepts, if you don't understand the difference between debit and credit, you really don't belong in the ERP space.
Well, and I recently had to deal with some code where it was an integration. There is an API available. This was for Dynamics GP. They didn't use the API. What did they do? They called their own store procedure that they wrote with 300 lines in it. That store procedure called 3 other store procedures, sending this cascade of store procedure calls. It is literally impossible to debug, given the architecture. They clearly knew what they were doing technically. Like, I could look at their code and say, yes, this person is technically competent developer on any given line, but the architecture was completely unmaintainable. I was like, there's nothing I can do here. I could spend 8 hours trying to debug this, and I really don't know where it's going to go. So that's my bigger concern.
And I agree 100%. And I'll tell you, there are a handful of time in my career where I had literally taken something and just wiped it out and started over, because it was one of those, I can spend another couple of days trying to figure this thing out, what's happening, or I can just do it so it does what it's supposed to do.
Yep. And so a couple things. Like, one, I'm less concerned about being nitpicky on the details. And I know Waldo has posted a screenshot of sample code, or I posted some screenshot of a demo code, and instantly, I mean, half in jest, right? People jump in and say, oh, well, why did you use this? And this technique is wrong. And they're nitpicking down to the character and giving people a hard time. And I'm like, to me, I'm operating up here because I have to. And that stuff, while you could nitpick about it, it's far less important than the overall solution being designed. Now, can you get into trouble? Absolutely, right? If you use some incorrect technique, that's bad practice. Will it come and bite you in ways you may not anticipate? I totally get that. But yeah.
On the bright side, a significant chunk of the old guide were definitely things like what's on the screen now, which are much more about the insurance of quality rather than the nitpickery of naming of things. Like, for example, we had the discussion on Twitter not too long back about, flow fields. They got to be set to editable no. And if you're a rookie developer who hasn't worked with flow fields before, since they're new to the product, that could be an easy thing to miss. But what it does is it potentially creates data that you're not expecting because you left it wide open. And a good one that is a rule in the category of things I know I have forgotten as a developer is on primary key. One of their recommendations is to set it to be not blank. And what this will do is it forces, the primary key of records being inserted have to have a value. And that's how you avoid having the blank customers and blank items and that sort of thing. And it's good. Yeah. It's very good practice, and it's important. To another one of the points that Henrik and I were talking about, we were talking about code versus text, and it's part of the table design concept. when you're as a developer looking at the system, you're going, okay, a bunch of things are labeled number and they're 20 character code fields, and a bunch of things are labeled something code and they're code 10. What's the story behind that? And Henrik, you had told me something that I had long since forgotten, which is that typically speaking, was it that code 10 was code, and then anything named number is typically 20 was the general rule that you went by?
Yep, and anything number, which is a code 20, also have a number series.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, that's how I've always been taught by my mentor, and that's what I have whipped into anybody that's ever wanted to listen to me. I mean, this goes back to some of the naming conventions that goes along with this thing as well, right? Where you have master data or you have kind of transactional data. They have a number series, and that's a code 20, and it's called number. And you have the you're probably going to get to that point as well, where the table name is singular and so forth as well. So I'm going to let you get there.
So, given that we no longer have this training program, we no longer have these documents and these formally and updated and maintained guidelines, how is this new world going to function? And on the one hand, I suspect it's going to be a little bit of the Wild West in a sense that a bunch of people will be new developers in the BCAL world, and they're going to push out some pretty crazy PTEs before they learn their lesson, right? And so how can some of this knowledge and these practices be brought to those new developers? And off the top of my head, we have the AL language extension doing some IntelliSense or syntax checking, and we have Code Cop and App Source Cop. Are there and snippets and the other toolbox type extensions? Are there other methods where we can try to collectively improve the quality of code?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. And most of the rest of the things I had on my deck of things to talk about in the guide here are these sort of things where they're nitpicking, but they're designed to get consistent quality in an important way. And you're right. It does boil down to the question of, as a new person, how should you be learning these things? And I think the best answer to that is that Microsoft is very much encouraging all of us to do pull requests against their repos and to make their ecosystem better. So one of the things that I would like to do is I'm planning to do some updates to the docs site as pull requests to try to get some better information added in there that maybe is a little buried or restructured or things like that to get it in there into a unified place so that it becomes part of the living document that Microsoft supports and brings forward. So at this point, that's my intention on it. But you bring me to one of the points I was going to wrap up with, but we can go early on this. This is fine. I don't want to be the arbiter of all things BCAL conversion and whatnot, and obviously with pull requests I wouldn't be. But I thought it might be real fun for all of us to be able to kind of go through these rules one by one and be able to share our thoughts about them. So I have thrown together this fun little tool. You can go to it right now if you want. It's cal.sparebrain.com, HTTPS, of course. And this is a web version of all of the old rules, so you can see what they were in the guidebook. And if you would like to, you can vote on the ones you think still have relevance. So wow. You can have some fun with this, and if you want to give some extra info about you never knew about this rule or you forgot, no problem. If things have been updated into code cops, or maybe they're part of the Cal formatting now, they'll be noted as such. I carefully crawled through and tried to match things up with some of the code cop rules and linked to them so you can see what they are. Uh, so have fun with that, everybody, and enjoy the nostalgia of the 2.5 screenshots recreated in CSS.
That is
Yeah,
hilarious.
and of course I have to point out the little icon that was on the menu buttons. I don't see that.
Absolutely. And I admit this is not a mobile friendly site, so I apologize, but it was a hobby project. And as people cruise along, you can just grab the results as a CSV. It'll aggregate all the votes on all the different rules, so anyone can have fun with analyzing this if they would like. But from this, at the end of the month, I'll start putting together all the rules that people think are important into some pull requests and link those and encourage people to add bits and pieces to it.
Wow. And you even have references to code cop rules in this, I see.
Hmm.
Holy
Absolutely.
cow. Where do you
Yep.
find the time?
It's been an interesting challenge for the past few days to find the time. I started this project probably about a week ago. It's a custom site running on top of a custom Node.js server. So,
Wow. Okay, you win. I give up.
well, I mean, to be fair, I had a little bit of help from a wonderful CSS project that lets you mock up some of the old Windows UI.
Wow.
But, yep.
Very cool. Well, I will put this on the Business Central resources page as another link. And now that I know about it, I'll promote it, and maybe we can focus in on a couple of the rules or practices to see what people think.
Absolutely. So it's fun to see some of the different rules and how they affect even what we're still doing today. For example, anytime they abbreviate things, they followed a particular set of rules around how they would include the words or not include the words. All of those are still there. And there are lots of things about numbering objects and numbering fields that are still relevant. And I think plenty of us sometimes forget some of the old ways of doing things. Like, for example, I think it's really interesting that when you're numbering table fields, they strongly recommended way back when, don't leave gaps if it's a brand new table. And a lot of us, including the developer class, they would encourage you to leave gaps in the fields, despite that being
Yep.
in the guide. So it was a little hit or miss even then. But there are some fun bits that I forgot in here as well. Like, for example, if you add a new field to customer table, you should leave a gap for it on the vendor table. I was like, what?
Interesting.
And that's kind of interesting. I actually didn't know that rule was there, but I always did, because if you add it on the contact table, right, and the automatic sync between there, then you'd have an issue. If they
Right.
so.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there are extensions that are out there today that you can run in Visual Studio Code that do these related field checks. So that way you can save yourself a little pain and suffering. If you add something to sales line, then, you need it in some other places as well. But
Yeah.
it makes logical sense. And so still some of these rules still apply, but definitely some of them don't anymore. I have definitely seen some, like, for example, they used to have internally at Navision, they had a rule of what objects would live in what ranges for reports and things like that. We don't see those now because, for example, all the 200 series sales reports are about to be retired in the next wave, if
Yeah.
I recall correctly.
Yeah.
And they put them in a new range that I think is for job.
Well, and as any programmer will tell you, it's like, yeah, we never will need more than 99 of those, right?
Mhm.
That's always bad news. Like, yep. Wow. Very cool. Okay, so that looks like a pretty extensive website and quite a bit of information. So, I mean, and we currently do not have formal training for BC development, right? We do
Mhm.
not have formal certification for BC development, only for the functional consultant do they have that exam and certification. Bigger picture, I mean, I'm one of these newbies coming in the BC dev space. I wonder if we need some guidance as to how to train, how to learn. As you know, Jeremy, I've been learning code, but I've asked questions of you like, wait, how do I name an object? I've got an affix, I've got a name, I've got a number, and I've only got 30 characters. Like, what is the
Yeah.
convention for trying to shove all this in there such that I don't have a mess at the end of the day?
Right. I mean, and that is quite honestly, the 30 character limit is challenging for sure, especially now that you use probably 5 of them for your affix, suffix, and whatnot else. But that there are very strict rules, or there used to be very strict rules, right? A table name is always singular, right? Because you don't put multiple records in one record. A card page is always so. Let's say, so in my code test that I give people, let me pull that up, and let me see if I can share that. This is going to show my thing here. I do that, and I do that one. So
We see a Skype logo.
how about now?
There we go. Well, oh, you know what? I'm only grabbing your Skype video feed. Interesting. Let me see if I can pop in. It's going to be manual, but let me see if I can pipe in your screen share. Skype shared screen. Okay, there we go. I'm going to have to manually switch it back. So
Yeah. So basically, this is the code test I have given people years ago. So this was in the NAV 2009. So basically, what I asked people to do, okay, create a table for a retail chain, associate that with a salesperson, and attach that to customers, and have that data flow through, right? And I mean, I even give them here the field names that I want. But basically, in this case here, right, the table name would be retail chain, right, with spaces, no dashes, and anything, and the code would be the primary key. That would be a code 10, and would have that not blank set to true. The page name. So if you created a list page, and let's say this had few fields, you want to be able to edit these records in that page. The page name would actually be plural, right? Retail chains. But if you look at, for instance, a customer list is not editable. Well, it is actually called a customer list. So even there are nomenclature that helps, that really tells you everything you need to know about the table or the page. And those were the things that I looked for when I did my code test.
quiz. Okay, quizzing a new developer. Got it.
And I created a contract with it as well. Again, number, and it's auto-assigned, and I expected there to get a number series. I literally had somebody who set the property to auto-increment and made that field an integer. And and it was one of those where, I mean, I can't necessarily blame the guy, because obviously, as you say, Steve, he was never taught how to actually do it, right? But it was just kind of like, this was my way to kind of gauge where they were. And then if they came in and say, no, I'm a senior guy, and they don't do stuff like that, no, you're not. But that's okay. I mean, I can work with it as long as people are willing to listen.
Okay.
So that's kind of where that is.
So let me switch back, and I have 2 questions from the chat. And So one is from Christian. If someone is getting into this, or if you have an organization that is new to Business Central and AL, what is more effective and can scale, self-learning or pair programming guided by an experienced dev? And I have my opinion on that, having bumbled through it myself. I don't, it is very difficult for any individual who is completely new to the BCAO world, I think, to learn this stuff. It's just like you'd have to read 1,000 pages and hope that you picked up the important clues. Whereas I have experience with both of you where in a 5-minute phone call, you can tell me something that I would have never encountered in hours and hours and hours of trying to figure this stuff out. There's just so much background knowledge that I personally don't know how a new developer could do it completely independently.
Yeah, the challenge is that it's a two-part question, which more effective and can scale. And unfortunately, that's like security and convenience. You just kind of have to find the balance between the two. So I think that probably the sweet spot would end up being a combination of self-learning and guided mentorship style programming. I know James Crowder has talked about how they take the approach of they do team-based development in that they assign a senior person and junior people to work in teams together, and they assign work to those groups, and they amongst themselves work through things, and that enables them to kind of load balance internally. And so I think probably the best bet is that we could use more learning resources that enable some of the self-learning pieces.
Yep.
But at the same time, the challenge there is there's also, I would call it a financial disincentive. There's great demand, but not a great financial investment in seeing that demand met. As wonderful and as entertaining as it is to be able to say, hey, I wrote a book about BC, that has sold about 30 copies, mostly to other professionals who already know how it works. So even though there's a demand, it's not strong enough of a pressure to leverage investment from people in some of those utilities. And I know I've seen a few people, I've referred people to Luke Van Voigt for some developer training, and they go, oh, this seems really good. Oh, 25 days, because I think one of his boot camps is a 25-day boot camp, and they go, I can't invest that much time. And it's like, well,
right.
Unfortunately.
Can't you point me to the Stack Overflow page that has everything I need to know?
Yeah, so I think even though there's a pressure right now that there needs to be more people and more skill up, more on-ramps into the space, there's no incentive for people to help others come up that ramp in any way, in any material way that I've seen come out there yet. I'm hopeful that over the next few years, maybe we'll see more mentorship opportunities evolve. I'm hopeful, for example, that my own company, I want to find more rookies to train into the space next year. It's something I enjoy doing, and I've done it a few different times, but it takes 6 months to a year, and it's just an investment. Some people don't want to do it.
On the training side, yes, like if Luke had a course that was 20 plus days, just logistically, that's pretty difficult for many people to work through, right? So, short of those on-site trainings, we're used to fly, right?
Yeah, but so I think his 20 some odd day thing, it is a week at a time. Then you're back home doing and then so I think it's a 4 or 5 week thing,
spread out.
Yeah.
Okay.
and so I mean, and I know, I mean, myself, when I first started in this world and got a job, I was ultimately I worked under a senior guy, and I ended up and this was back when I worked in Denmark. I went to a week-long class I mean, just like when you get a driver's license, right? When you get your driver's license, that doesn't mean you know how to drive per se. You know the rules and the mechanics, but you actually haven't been out driving a
Right.
lot. So I went to two 1 week classes, 1 week in the old blue classic client, so to speak, or DOS client, and 1 week in Navision financials. Um, and then I got shipped to Texas with a coworker, with a senior guy, and I basically worked under him, and case in point, the very first thing I did, I created a return check wizard, which that terminology was foreign to me already, because in Denmark, even back 20 years ago, we did not use checks. But I wrote this piece of code, right? I don't know, 60, 80 lines of code, and it populated a general journal, and it posted it, and damn, it was cool. And my coworker looked at it, okay, well, but if you use validate, you don't need this, and all of a sudden, before I know it, my code was down to 10, 15 lines of code. Right? But I learned a lot by that, and basically getting assigned parts of his work to me, and then him reviewing it and going it through with me was how I learned.
Waldo posted a comment that Plataan has an online boot camp that you can do whenever you have time. So I'll need to look into that. I'll see if I have a link to that in the BC resources page. I don't recall, so I'll have to look that up.
I was looking at that myself, and it looks like Steve Renders, for example, has a few courses over on that as well. So that looks pretty potentially useful. And Ted's comment that NAV was 2 weeks in Atlanta. Yes, it was.
Yep. And another comment that Ted made that I've chatted with him separately about is, with BC specifically and AL and all the related technologies, I can do a blog post or a video, and within a month, it can be technically obsolete, incorrect, no longer valid, because something changed. And that is a dimension that makes all of this very challenging. And so if I were to invest the time in building a training course, it's not, I don't finish that, right? It's going to be this constant maintenance. And to your point, Jeremy, that's expensive. And so anyone who wants just a simple static online learning resource or something for free, I don't see how it can be maintained. 6 months later, it'll be out of date. There'll be many things that don't work. So that is one challenge with maintaining these resources. And I'm sure the Microsoft Docs people know this very, very well, right?
Yep, absolutely. And, one of the things I've enjoyed doing this year, I've had a few people reach out to me, and we've done some personalized one-on-one training here and there for a few weeks, where they just needed to skill up into BC from their old NAV solution. They had customers who they're supporting day in, day out that are on NAV that they know are going to at some point say, I need you to be my BC guy, and they aren't ready for that moment in that conversation still. So I've had a few people reach out to me for individualized training just to try to help bridge that gap. And I found that has been very successful for me, because it allowed us to say, okay, you already know everything that I would teach you about building code units and all these sort of things. You just need to know, okay, how do I work efficiently over in this other space as well? And Chad also has plenty of good points that there are lots of individual videos on topics. There's so many great free resources. I don't think that there's a lot of free resources for absolutely getting started. I think the closest for development getting started is your series working through Christoph's book.
Right. And to your point about the individual topics, so someone makes a note, Inga, that Eric Hugard has some great videos, right? Mm-hmm. And so there are people who've made videos. There are many blogs that are excellent. there are also classes. So like I've taken AJ's classes on APIs. I've taken Waldo's
Yes.
class on development and Git. And and Luke's class on automated testing. So I've taken these classes on individual topics and ancillary topics for the ecosystem, but like I'm still very weak on the core coding piece. Like that's where I tend to have a lot of questions. So, and when you're doing these keyhole classes one at a time, assembling them over the course of 6 or 12 months and maintaining that knowledge is actually quite challenging, I found.
Well, maybe in all of our collective copious spare times, we can take the Cal workbook that you were supposed to work through before going to solution developer class, learning the basics of creating tables and things like that. See if we can update something along those lines, add some pieces. We'll bug Christoph to see if we can splice some extra steps into his book.
Yeah, I think that would be valuable. And I think kind of if there's a boot camp concept that might gain some traction, and who maintains it and how, that's the big question, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, maybe we'll be able to entice some of the Microsoft community managers who are trying to do a lot of really good community development work with user groups to find some value of that in the BC space. Maybe that would be good.
Well, so Christoph is saying here in the comments that in the chat that he's working on a version 2. So we look forward to us, Christoph.
Yep. So any other thoughts, topics?
Well, I guess I should add just a few things here. I mean, so we are talking about learning and whatnot else, and as I said from the get-go, I'm a dinosaur in this world. I've been doing this for 20 years. There are still stuff that I don't know. There's still stuff that I have to dig down. So to just because you've been here a long time doesn't mean you know everything, right? So it's always interesting, and I mean I've seen stuff that I know experienced developers do, and they do some interesting stuff, and I look at a guy, did they not know about this function in standard nav? And there's been I mean, it's not until I would say probably within the last year I realized, wait, I can just use a get on a record ID. I don't have to maneuver it all around. Holy crap! Mind blown. So there are so many different intricacies, and I think there's a lot of these kind of things where that's not used very much in the base product, so that's why you just never even think about it necessarily as a developer. So yeah,
and
constantly learning.
Not only are there many things that I didn't know about, but it's as I learn new things, I am noticing other things are just dropping off. So I learned about APIs. I focus on something else for 6 months, and I have to go back and relearn that. Or I knew more about purchasing processes and functionality, and then I'm realizing it's just fading as I don't touch that functionality. And I once had an interesting conversation with someone who claimed to be able to support Dynamics GP, Nav/BC, and F&O simultaneously and be competent in those. And I'm like, I'm sure you're very good at whatever you do, but I find it very hard to believe that you are a deep expert in each of those products. And I've seen the same thing. I did a tweet a while back where there was a job posting where someone said they had a decade of experience with GP, a decade of experience with Nav and BC, 8 years of experience with F&O, plus CRM, plus C#, plus C++, and the list just went on. And I'm like, wow, you must be the grand wizard, because I can maybe do 3 of those things effectively. So,
yep.
Okay.
Christian joking in the comments to give Christoph the time turner. And
yes,
I was thinking that's who you were getting the job listing from, someone using a time machine.
Well, I will. I've been in touch with Christoph to see what I can do to help with the version 2 of the beginner's guide. Obviously, I've spent a bit of time with that document, so maybe we can see if we can update it and include some practices and some of these tips and guidelines for how to improve your code or learn a little bit more about the best practices of AL.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we can potentially do to help is I think a lot of times, I know in my experience, when I want to put something together, I mentally go, it has to be as polished and as good as I can possibly make it, like to be on the Microsoft level. And realistically, one of the best books that I bought in the past year that had a lot of value to it was a book by Tom Hurst online, just a fellow I follow on Twitter. And, honestly, it looked like it was written in Notepad with Markdown. And, it was completely unformatted in a lot of ways, but the content was amazing. So, like I think that's one of the things that we try to do a little bit too much of when we're trying to create tools and things like that to on-ramp people is we try to over-engineer and build the three lane wide on-ramp. No, we just need a dirt hill to get us up there.
And I think there is a strong parallel in the software development world, right? The developer says, well, what if the customer needs this? We'd better have extensibility over here, and we need to have the potential for multi-currency, multi-language. And it's like, okay, 1,000 hours later, you have no product to ship. And so I've learned that lesson, and I'm like, minimum viable product. We are shipping, pushing it out the door. There are bugs. We're not missing features. Like, hey, we'll iterate. It's kind of more the SpaceX Elon Musk methodology of rocket development, right? Hey, it's okay. So as long as, everyone's safe and you're not deleting random data, we should be able to get through it. So. Okay. Well, any closing thoughts, or are we good to wrap up?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Took almost an hour too, so yeah, that's good.
Yep. And like I said, I'll have that little CAL guideline site up. And what I'm planning to do is in October, do a bunch of pull requests based on some of those to try to help the docs team out and fold some of these guidelines into the best practices page. So it's a little more comprehensive, and hopefully folks will be interested in joining in on that.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for joining and for the topic. I think it was a good discussion. We had a lot of conversation in the chat, a very good attendance. Everyone wants to see you guys, because a lot more people on the live stream than my normal live stream, I can tell you. So anyway, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining and watching. And I hope this was valuable. And feel free and comment below if you have questions. And I'll try to remember to put the links below the YouTube video in the description section, links to Jeremy's site and the Plataan course and any other resources. Make a note if I missed anything. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks Jeremy and Henrik.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good day.